Hey there, night owls and thrill seekers. This is Cyrus Kade, your friendly neighborhood freelance investigative reporter, coming to you from the chilly streets of Minneapolis. Tonight, we're diving into a tale that'll make your blood run colder than a Minnesota winter. So grab your coffee, turn up the heat, and settle in. You're about to hear a story that'll have you checking your locks twice. It all started on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. I was hunched over my desk, sifting through the usual pile of dead-end leads and cold cases when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally I'd let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. Kade here, I answered, my voice gruff from too many late nights and not enough sleep. Mr. Kade, the voice on the other end was barely above a whisper. I've got a story for you. One that'll make your career or end it. Now I've heard my fair share of dramatic introductions, but this sent a shiver down my spine. I'm listening, I said, reaching for my notepad. The Villisca Axe Murder house, the voice continued. You've heard of it, right? Of course I had. Any self-respecting journalist with a penchant for the macabre knows about the Villisca Axe murders. June 10, 1912, a night that left 8 people dead, including 6 children, all brutally slaughtered with an axe. The case remains unsolved to this day. A festering wound in American crime history. What about it? I asked, my pen poised over the paper. It's happening again, the voice whispered, here, in Minneapolis. And just like that, I was hooked. The line went dead before I could ask any more questions, but it didn't matter. I had a lead, and by God, I was going to follow it. I spent the next few hours digging into recent crime reports in the Minneapolis area. Nothing stood out at first glance. The usual smattering of petty thefts, domestic disturbances, and drunken disorderlies. But then, buried in the back pages of a local news site, I found it. A small blurb about a family of 4 found dead in their home. Cause of death? Blunt force trauma. My heart raced as I read the details. The Johnsons, Mark, Sarah, and their 2 kids, Emily and Ethan, were discovered by a neighbor who noticed they hadn't picked up their morning paper. The police were tight-lipped about the specifics, but one detail leaked out. All the mirrors in the house had been covered. Just like in Villisca. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the night. The address wasn't hard to find, a quaint little 2-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where people say, things like this don't happen here. But they do. They always do. Yellow police tape fluttered in the chilly night air as I approached the house. A lone patrol car sat out front, its occupant more interested in his phone than his surroundings. Perfect. I slipped around the side of the house, my footsteps muffled by the damp grass. The back door was locked, but a quick bit of, let's call it investigative maneuvering, and I was in. The interior was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and something else, something older, mustier, like old books and forgotten memories. I made my way through the kitchen, my pen light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Everything seemed normal, dishes in the sink, a half-empty bottle of wine on the counter. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze. The mirrors. Every single one was covered with sheets or blankets. My breath caught in my throat as I remembered the details of the Villisca case. The killer had done the same thing there, over a century ago. I crept up the stairs, each creak of the floorboard sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The bedrooms were at the top, and I knew what I'd find there. But knowing and seeing are 2 very different things. The master bedroom door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of my penlight fell on the bed, and I had to stifle a gasp. Mark and Sarah Johnson lay there, their bodies twisted in a grotesque tableau of violence. The sheets were soaked crimson, and the walls were splattered with blood. But it was their faces that haunted me, or rather, what was left of them. Just like Josiah Moore and Villisca, their faces had been obliterated, reduced to unrecognizable pulp by the fury of the axe. I stumbled back, fighting the urge to retch. This was bad. This was very, very bad. But I knew I had to press on. The children's rooms were next. Emily's room was a pink paradise, stuffed animals still arranged neatly on shelves, but the bed told a different story. The little girl's body was small, so small against the blood-soaked sheets, her golden curls matted with gore. Ethan's room was last. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I'd seen a lot in my years as a reporter, but this was testing my limits. I pushed the door open and nothing. The room was empty. The bed was made, untouched. No blood, no body, just a normal little boy's room. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe Ethan had escaped. Maybe he was out there somewhere, alive, and that's when I heard it. A soft thump from above. The attic. My blood ran cold as I remembered another detail from the Villisca case. The killer had hidden in the attic, waiting for the family to fall asleep. I looked up at the ceiling, my penlight beam shaking. There, in the corner, was a small hatch. It was slightly ajar. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house and call the police. But I couldn't. I had to know. I found a chair and dragged it under the hatch. Standing on it, I reached up and slowly pushed the hatch open. The hinges creaked, the sound impossibly loud in the silent house. I poked my head up into the attic, my penlight sweeping the dusty space. At first, I saw nothing but old boxes and forgotten furniture. But then, in the far corner, I caught a glimpse of movement. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, are you up here?" Another thump, louder this time. And then, emerging from the shadows, a figure. But it wasn't Ethan. It was too tall, too broad to be a young boy. The beam of my penlight fell on the figure's face, and I felt my heart stop. It was a man, middle-aged, with wild eyes and a scraggly beard. In his hands he clutched an axe, its blade dark with dried blood. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "No one should be here." I scrambled back, nearly falling through the hatch in my haste. The man advanced, the axe raised high. "Wait," I shouted, desperate for anything that might save me. "Why? Why did you do this?" The man paused, his eyes narrowing. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "No one understands, but I have to. I have to keep doing it until I get it right." "Get what right?" I asked, my mind racing. "The ritual," he replied, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "The one that will bring them back, all of them. The Moors, the Stillingers, all of them. But it has to be perfect. Every detail has to match." I realized then that I was dealing with a madman, a copycat killer obsessed with the Villisca murders, convinced he could somehow undo the past. "But Ethan," I said, grasping at straws. "Where's Ethan?" The man's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Ethan? Oh, he's here. He's always been here." And with that, he lunged forward, the axe whistling through the air. I threw myself to the side, tumbling out of the attic and onto the floor below. Pain shot through my arm, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. Down the stairs, through the living room, out the front door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The man stood in the doorway of the house, the axe hanging at his side. And next to him, barely visible in the shadows, was a small figure. A boy. Ethan. I drove straight to the police station, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. The cops were skeptical at first, but when they went to check out the house, they found exactly what I'd described. Well, almost exactly. The bodies were there, the covered mirrors, the blood-splattered walls, but there was no sign of the man with the axe, and no sign of Ethan. The case blew up overnight. "Villisca copycat strikes in Minneapolis," the headlines screamed. I should have been elated. This was the story of a lifetime after all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That somewhere out there, the man with the axe was planning his next ritual. And Ethan? What about Ethan? Was he a victim or an accomplice? A ghost or something worse? Weeks passed. The police investigation hit dead end after dead end. The media frenzy died down, but I couldn't let it go. I kept digging, following every lead, no matter how small. And then, exactly 1 month after that night at the Johnson house, I got another call. "Mr. Kade," the same whispered voice from before. "It's happening again." This time, the address led me to an old farmhouse on the outskirts of the city. As I pulled up, I could see the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. I was too late. Detective Sarah Reeves, my sometimes ally in the police department, met me at the police line. Her face was grim. "5 dead," she said without preamble. 2 adults, 3 kids. Same MO as the Johnson murders. "And the mirrors?" I asked. She nodded. "All covered." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Any sign of a survivor?" A boy? Reeves gave me a strange look. No. Why? I shook my head. Just a hunch. Can I take a look inside? She hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Don't touch anything. The scene inside was a carbon copy of the Johnson house. Blood everywhere. Faces destroyed beyond recognition, and in the children's rooms, small bodies arranged with almost loving care on blood-soaked beds. But it was in the master bedroom that I found it. Carved into the headboard, barely visible beneath the blood spatter, was a message. Come find me, Kade. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. He knew my name. He was calling me out. I showed Reeves the message. Her face paled. Kade, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? I didn't have an answer for her. But I knew I couldn't stop now. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was personal. Over the next few months, 3 more families were slaughtered. Each time, the same brutal method. Each time, a message left for me. And each time, I arrived too late to do anything but document the aftermath. The city was in a panic. The police were under intense pressure to make an arrest. And me? I was losing sleep, losing weight, losing my grip on reality. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw blood-splattered walls and covered mirrors. And always, the shadowy figure of a man with an axe. It was after the 5th murder that I finally caught a break. A neighbor reported seeing a beat-up old truck leaving the scene just before the bodies were discovered. It wasn't much, but it was something. I spent days tracking down every beat-up truck in the city and surrounding areas. And finally, I found it. Parked outside a rundown cabin in the woods, miles from anywhere. I should have called the police. I should have waited for backup. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to know. The cabin was dark as I approached, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. And something else. Something metallic and sickeningly familiar. My beam fell on a wall covered in newspaper clippings. Articles about the Villisca murders. About the recent killings in Minneapolis. And in the center, a faded photograph of the Moore family taken just days before their deaths. Beautiful, isn't it? I whirled around, my heart in my throat. There he was, the man with the axe. Up close, I could see the madness in his eyes, the way his hands shook with barely contained energy. Why? I managed to choke out. Why are you doing this? He smiled, a terrible, sad smile. To bring them back, of course, to undo what was done. Each family, each killing brings us closer to the truth, to the moment when the veil between worlds is thinnest. And Ethan? I asked, remembering the small figure I'd seen that first night. The man's smile widened. Ethan understands. He's seen beyond the veil. He knows what needs to be done. From the shadows behind him, a small figure emerged. Ethan, but not the Ethan I'd expected. This Ethan's eyes were empty, his face a mask of eerie calm. In his hands, he held a small axe. It's time, Mr. Kade, the man said, raising his own axe. Time for you to join our ritual, to help us bring them back. I backed away, my mind racing. This was it. This was how it ended. In a moldy cabin in the woods at the hands of a madman and a ghost child. But then, just as the man lunged forward, axe raised high, a sound cut through the night. Sirens. Police sirens getting closer by the second. The man froze, his eyes wide with panic. No, he whispered. No, not now. We're so close. I saw my chance and took it. I dove to the side, rolling past the man and out the open door. Behind me, I heard him howl with rage, heard the thud of the axe embedding itself in the doorframe. I ran through the woods, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The sirens grew louder, and I could see flashing lights through the trees. I burst out of the woods just as the first police car pulled up. Detective Reeves jumped out, gun drawn. Kade! What the hell? In there, I gasped, pointing back towards the cabin. He's in there. With Ethan. Reeves barked orders into her radio, and within moments, the woods were swarming with cops. They surrounded the cabin, shouting for the occupants to come out with their hands up. But when they finally breached the door, they found nothing. The cabin was empty, no man with an axe, no Ethan, just the wall of newspaper clippings and a faint smell of blood. The search went on for days. They combed every inch of those woods, but found no trace of the killer or the boy. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. The case went cold. The killings stopped. Life in Minneapolis slowly returned to normal, but I couldn't let it go. I knew they were out there somewhere, waiting, planning, preparing for the next ritual. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the shadows grow long, I swear I can hear the sound of an axe being sharpened, and a child's laughter echoing in the darkness. So that's my story, folks. The tale of the Minneapolis axe murders as I lived it. Is it over? I doubt it. Somewhere out there, a man with an axe and a ghost child are waiting, watching. And when the time is right, when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest, they'll strike again, because that's what I do. I'm Cyrus Kade, and I chase the stories others are too afraid to touch, the ones that lurk in the shadows, just beyond the edge of reason. But let me tell you, dear listeners, this case, it changed me. It's been months since that night in the cabin, and I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That somewhere out there, Ethan and his axe-wielding guardian are biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I've become obsessed. I'll admit it. My apartment walls are covered with timelines, newspaper clippings, and photos connected by red string. I've pored over every detail of the Villisca case, looking for clues, for patterns, for anything that might help me understand what's happening here in Minneapolis. And then, just last week, I found something. Something that made my blood run cold. I was digging through old census records, trying to trace the history of the families that had been killed. And there, buried in the dusty pages of history, I found a connection. A thread that tied it all together. Each of the families, the Johnsons, the Millers, the Patels, the Nguyen's, and the Cohens, had a common ancestor. A man named Josiah Stillinger. Josiah Stillinger. The name hit me like a punch to the gut, because Josiah and Sarah Stillinger were two of the victims in the original Villisca murders. Their two young daughters, Lena and Ina, were killed alongside them. But here's the kicker. Josiah had a brother who wasn't in the house that night, a brother who survived. My hands shook as I dug deeper. The brother's name was Ezekiel Stillinger. After the murders, he left Villisca, changing his name and trying to outrun the tragedy. But you can't outrun the past. It always catches up to you. Ezekiel, I discovered, had settled here in Minneapolis. He married, had children. His descendants spread out, changed names, intermarried, but the blood connection remained. All of the families killed in Minneapolis were descendants of Ezekiel Stillinger, of the Villisca survivors. It was a revelation that should have broken the case wide open. But when I took it to Detective Reeves, she just shook her head. "It's circumstantial, Kade," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "We can't issue an alert based on someone's great-great-grandfather. Do you know how many people in this city might be distantly related to the Villisca victims?" I argued, of course, pointed out the impossibility of it being a coincidence. But Reeves wouldn't budge. The case remained cold, but I couldn't let it go. I started tracking down other Stillinger descendants in the area, warning them, urging them to be careful. Most thought I was crazy. A few listened. One family even agreed to let me install cameras around their house. And that's how I found myself on a cold January night, huddled in my car outside the Peterson family home. The Petersons, Mark, Lisa, and their 3 kids, were direct descendants of Ezekiel Stillinger. If my theory was correct, they were prime targets. I'd been watching for hours, my thermos of coffee long since emptied, when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the shadows at the side of the house. I sat up straighter, my heart pounding. Again. A figure, moving with unnatural stillness towards the back door, and behind it, a smaller shape. A child. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "This is Cyrus Kade," I said as soon as the operator picked up. "I need police at 1418 Maple Street immediately. The axe murderer is here." I didn't wait for a response. I dropped the phone and got out of the car, grabbing the baseball bat I'd started keeping in the back seat. I knew it was stupid. I knew I should wait for the police. But I couldn't just sit there and watch another family die. I crept around the side of the house, my footsteps muffled by the freshly fallen snow. As I rounded the corner, I saw them, the man with the axe working on the back door lock, and next to him, Ethan, his small face eerily calm in the moonlight. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shattering the night silence. "Get away from there." The man's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, with a growl of rage, he charged. I swung the bat, aiming for his head, but he was faster than I expected. He ducked under my swing and barreled into me, knocking us both into the snow. We grappled, rolling in the cold powder. I could feel the strength in his arms, the madness giving him an almost superhuman power. The axe had fallen nearby, and we both scrambled for it. My fingers closed around the handle just as he grabbed my ankle, yanking me back. I kicked out, feeling my foot connect with something solid. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening. I scrambled to my feet, the axe now in my hands. The man looked up at me, blood trickling from his nose where my kick had landed. "You don't understand," he gasped. "We have to do this. We have to bring them back." "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's over. The police are on their way." His eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. That's when I remembered Ethan. I glanced around, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my leg. I looked down to see Ethan, his small face contorted with rage, a knife buried in my thigh. I stumbled, the axe slipping from my grasp. The man seized his opportunity, lunging for the weapon. But before he could reach it, the night exploded with light and sound. "Police, freeze!" Squad cars had pulled up, their lights painting the snow in alternating red and blue. Officers poured out, guns drawn. The man hesitated for a split second, then turned to run. He didn't make it 3 steps before the officers tackled him to the ground. I sagged against the side of the house, my leg throbbing. An officer approached me asking if I was all right. I nodded, then remembered Ethan. "The boy," I gasped. There was a boy. But when we looked around, Ethan was gone, vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics patched up my leg. Detectives took my statement. The Petersons were brought out of the house, shaken but unharmed. And the man with the axe? He was identified as Robert Stillinger, a distant cousin of the Peterson family. A man with a history of mental illness and an obsession with his family's connection to the Villisca murders. It should have been over. The killer was caught. The murders solved. But as I watched them load Robert into a police car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. That this wasn't the end, but just another chapter in a story that had been unfolding for over a century. Because there was still one question that no one could answer. Who was Ethan? And where had he gone? In the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Minneapolis axe murderer was behind bars, awaiting trial. My story broke nationwide, catapulting me into a spotlight I wasn't sure I wanted, but I couldn't let it go. The image of Ethan, his small face twisted with adult rage, haunted my dreams. I dug deeper into the Stillinger family history, looking for any mention of an Ethan. I interviewed Robert in prison, trying to get him to talk about the boy. But he just smiled that eerie, knowing smile and said, "He'll be back. When the time is right, he'll be back." And then just last night, it happened. I was at home, poring over old documents when my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Look outside," it read. I went to the window, my heart pounding. And there, standing on the sidewalk across the street, was a small figure. A boy, his face hidden in the shadows of a hooded sweatshirt. As I watched, frozen in disbelief, he raised his head. Our eyes met across the distance, and I felt a chill run through me. Because in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The boy Ethan raised his hand in a small wave. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he'd been. My mind raced with questions, theories, fears, but one thing was clear. The story of the Minneapolis axe murders wasn't over. It was just beginning. And I, Cyrus Kade, would be there to uncover the truth, no matter where it led, no matter the cost. So lock your doors, dear listeners. Check your mirrors. And if you hear the sound of an axe being sharpened in the night, well, you might just be the next chapter in this twisted tale. This is Cyrus Kade, signing off. But don't worry, I'll be back. After all, the night is dark and full of stories waiting to be told. Stay tuned and stay safe, because in this city, under the cover of darkness, anything can happen, and often does. Good night, Minneapolis. Sleep tight, and remember, always keep one eye open.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.